I want to share a game of chess that I played just a few days ago on the live chess server. I think it's a very entertaining and fun game with a interesting sacrificial tactical attack. But the reason I'm sharing it with you is not just to show off one of my games. It's actually because this was a game that I thought I had played pretty well and went back and looked at it over with the computer afterward and realized that I hadn't played as perfectly as I thought. I made a number of errors. There were some inaccuracies in how I conducted it, but I felt that it was a very good learning experience. And found that the game really had more to meet the eye than my initial impressions of it. And I thought that it was a good lesson in how to use the computer well in a smart way to help you figure out what your mistakes and areas for improvement are in a chess game. And I'm saying this as someone who is a FIDE master level player, but played pretty much all of my chess tournament career at a time before the current computer revolution, before we had all these modern strong engines and the capabilities to analyze the games as accurately as we do now. And I learned a lot about what I was doing wrong and how to get better by going over games with a human teacher, which was a very good way at the time. But nowadays, with the proliferation of super strong engines and the easy availability of them on the chess servers, I feel like they are a great primary tool for a lot of learners. But one of the challenges is that the chess programs give you data, a bunch of numbers basically, in analyzing a position that aren't always that easy to understand and make sense of in terms of what is it really telling me I'm doing wrong, what things that the computer labels as a mistake are actually mistakes or are things that are maybe noise in the data that don't make a lot of sense. So I've learned a lot of these lessons the hard way as I've adventured on the chess servers with these machines. And I'm hoping to share some of my experience doing that. But what I'm going to do for starters actually is look over the game briefly without the use of the computer engine. Just going through the moves and telling sort of what my impressions of the game were from the outset before I analyzed it with the computer. And then contrast that later with what I learned as I drilled down and analyzed it in more detail with the computer. So I was playing the black pieces here. You can see my name down at the bottom of the screen here, and at the top of the screen is my opponent's name, also a master level player, and we were playing a 3-minute game. In fact, this was 3 minutes with a 2-second increment, so there will be times when a very quick move is made and the time actually goes up on the clock, but we'll see the time changing at those bottom and top lines as we play through to give an impression of how much time was left for each player. One thing to keep in mind is this game gets very tactical, and there's no practical way players of our level would be able to analyze all of these tactics precisely in a 3-minute time control. And I'm not expecting that I would have. But at the same time, I also wanted to sort of understand where the ground truth of the game was and where my intuition was succeeding and where it was failing and where I really needed to supplement that intuition with more concrete calculation. So let me go through and show you what happened. I'm not going to spend a lot of time dwelling on the first 12 moves or so of the game because the opening isn't that interesting. It's a Winawer French, which results in a delayed exchange variation, which has a little more tension than the usual exchange variation. And after a few simple developing moves, I pinned his knight in order to provoke a pawn weakness on the king's side and retreated my bishop back. And after 9 moves, we're at this position. And I've played this kind of position many times before, and I've often played it by castling queenside for black and then going for a kingside pawn advance and attacking in that way. But I decided to play a slightly more ambitious plan this time where I started my kingside pawn advance before actually castling, which entailed some risk, but I first captured the knight, which is kind of the last moment that I can while white still has to recapture with a pawn in order not to lose his d-pawn. And then I followed up with h6 with the immediate idea after rook e1 of playing g5. And after his bishop retreated, I followed up with f5 right away. So this is a very, as I mentioned, ambitious plan, going for a kingside pawn storm when my king is still in the center. But I hoped that his knight was a bit passive at e2, didn't really have any moves right now, and it was in a kind of uncomfortable place, and that slowness and getting it out of the way is going to actually allow me to get away with playing like this, was my so-called thought here. But my opponent followed up with bishop b5, and after I knocked the bishop back, I decided to play in an enterprising way, charging forward this pawn too, which encages his bishop, but it also weakens my queen side where it looked like I was probably going to castle my queen before. However, I then switched up plans and played knight f6 and decided I'm going to castle on the king side. And after a4, going after my pawns and threatening a little capture because of the pin on the a file, I immediately castled so the rooks were connected. And at this point, I feel like my strategy's kind of worked out for me, I thought. I've gotten my king to safety. I've got a good position to attack on the king side, and his bishop at b3 doesn't look so good. My opponent then tried a very interesting plan here of trying to break open this kingside pawn wedge and show that my king was too exposed with h4, which led to me pushing his bishop back, marching my king up, and a couple other moves, bringing the knight over to the king side, and he then played g3. So he's really sort of lighting that king side on fire now, making sure that a lot of pawn exchanges are going to happen that are going to target my king. But I really wasn't too worried about that because I felt that all of my pieces over here that are pretty close to the king side are actually going to be more active and aggressive than white's pieces on the king side, and I think I have the better attacking chances, was at least my thought during the game. And we followed up after g3 with my knight charging into f5, and suddenly the game got very tactical. There were a few trades, and after g takes f4, I suddenly hopped in with knight h4, threatening a big royal fork to f3, where I'll be attacking the king and the queen. White has to do something about this, obviously. It's a big threat here. And he decided to defend with the king up to f2, but I immediately followed up by slamming my bishop to g4, which now you can see has some nice tactics here on the f-file. One of the ideas behind this is that white can't take the bishop because of knight e4 check, forking the king and queen, but white also can't take the pawn to g5 for the same reason, because now knight e4 check also works because of the pin on the g-file. So I hope that these two, or the pin on the f-file, I hope that these two tactics would mean that I was suddenly crashing through on f3 at a time when he couldn't defend it well. And sure enough, white followed up with knight g1 to try to defend, but I said no problem. I'm going to snap that pawn off at f3 anyway. And after knight f3, I charged my queen into h3. And white tried to slow down the attack by trading pieces, but it didn't work too much. Knight h4, queen h2 check, knight g2. But now I followed up with knight e4 check, which in this position does not win the queen, but it wins the exchange. But you can see that the dust is cleared after rook takes e4, d takes e4. And at this point, black has just an overwhelming position. Material count is pretty close. White does have two pieces for a rook, but at the same time, the king is so exposed and the pressure on the f-file and the second rank pin so great that white's king is about to get into a checkmating attack. Black has either rook takes f4 or g takes f4 coming, and it's going to be overwhelming, and there really is no good defense for white here. And sure enough, white in this position actually just played one more move of king e1 and then resigned before there even was a chance for me to make my next move. But it is a dead loss position for white, and one of the simplest reasons for that is simply queen g1 check forces the king to interfere with the queen and knight's defense, allowing queen takes knight check, and now the attack continues and black even has a material advantage. So it seemed like a pretty game to me. But as I said, not everything is as simple as first meets the eye. And what I'm going to do now is actually turn on the computer engine so we can see the evaluation bar on the right-hand side of the screen as we go through this game, and we can start to see how these scores change. I will tell you that I don't have my computer set up to the highest memory and depth for analysis right now while we are going over this video, just because it takes a lot of CPU power on my computer, and I also need it to record the video here. but I did earlier on, prior to making this video, actually review the game in full with the computer at a higher depth level, higher memory use, in order to try to make sure that I was getting pretty close to the ground truth on a lot of this. So, as I said, I'm not going to dwell a lot on most of the opening, but I am going to skip ahead to where really the first major error of the game was. So this was out of this French defense. The computer was actually pretty fine with the moves that both players made here. You can see the evaluation bars swinging just a little bit, but not in really major ways early on. It does say there is a slight advantage for white at this point, which is somewhere between a half a pawn and a full pawn, less than a full pawn. I think right now it's saying about plus 0.6 numerically. But this is what I consider to be nothing more than a normal white first move opening advantage out of a lot of openings. You expect it because white is going first. They're going to have a tiny advantage, and black getting full equality is not going to happen unless white makes some mistake. So despite whatever little fluctuations there were early on, it's nothing that I was too concerned about. However, it is the case on the next move that I made that there really was a serious error which changed the evaluation of this. And part of what I'm going to do as I go through this is not just keep that evaluation bar on, but actually turn on annotations now so that you can see the annotations I've given in terms of question marks, exclamation points, things like that for moves in the game. And I want to be clear that I did use the computer to help me with this, but these are actually not the computer's annotations. These are my own annotations that I made using my own human judgment combined with what the computer was telling me. So my move F5 is actually the first kind of crucial error of the game, which takes this beyond a point of what I would call a slight advantage to potentially more than that for white. The computer says about plus 1.6 at this point. And this is actually, before we get into why F5 right away is not the best move, this is actually, I think, a good moment to pause and talk about what we mean by these computer evaluations when I say a plus 1.6. So you've probably seen these if you played on the chess servers, and you might know that they are roughly tied to the material counts in a position such that if all else is equal, all other positional factors are the same, but one side has one extra pawn, you would expect a plus 1 for that side. Plus 1 meaning white has the advantage, or minus 1 meaning black has the advantage. But the numbers don't just mean the material count. They also incorporate a lot of other positional characteristics. But the question is, what do those numbers actually mean in terms of how likely you are to win the game? And this is where I'm going to put up a little range that I like to think about when I consider evaluations here. And I'm using the old-fashioned informant notation here, where we use an equal sign for an equal position, a plus over equals for a slight advantage for white, or equals over plus is a slight advantage for black. Plus over minus or minus over plus means a clear advantage, and a plus minus or a minus plus would be a winning, a decisive advantage. So I've given ranges here that I think these ranges of equity of point value correspond to in terms of those kind of qualitative descriptions. And my numbers might be a little controversial here. So I've said that, 0 obviously is dead equal, but you rarely get an exact 0 unless you have a forced draw by repetition or perpetual check or something like that. More often there's a little bit of noise and you might see a slight positive or negative 0.01, 2, or 3. But in my opinion, anything that small is not serious enough to really worry about. And I would consider anything from about a negative 0.3 to 0.3 just about equal. So I've only looked at the positive numbers here, but the same goes for the negative numbers when black is the one who is better. Whereas anything that's getting closer to about a half pawn advantage to somewhere a little less than a pawn and a half, maybe a pawn and a quarter or so, is what I would call a slight advantage for one side. But when you get starting to get closer to a 1.5 advantage, up to about 2 points, now we're talking about what I consider to be a clear advantage for one side or the other. And this is probably the most controversial part of what I'm saying here, is that anything beyond about a 2-point advantage is what I consider in the realm of a decisive advantage. Now, you might think that that is extreme. And depending on the level that you play at and the level that your opponents are, it might be. Because keep in mind that I am a master level player and I'm playing most other players who are masters here. But it is often the case at the amateur levels where there are a lot more inaccuracies and errors. There are much bigger comebacks and swings in equity. So it might be that an advantage of 2 points or more is not really the level of what you consider to be a decisive advantage yet. Maybe you draw that line at 2.5 or 3 or somewhere else. You can argue for whatever you like on that particular thing. But in my opinion, most of the time in master level play, once the advantage gets to be more than about 2 points, comebacks become rare. And it is the case that that is enough of an advantage for a good player, provided they have the adequate time on the clock to do so to convert that win. But truth be told, even if you disagree with my threshold of saying about 2 points is what you'd call a decisive advantage, I don't think it really changes the salient argument here, which is that changes in equity in these small ranges between quality, slight advantage, and clear advantage and decisive advantage are actually much more important than changes in equity once you get beyond about 2 or 3 or so, or wherever you happen to draw that line. So, like, if you have a +3 advantage or a +5 advantage or a +8 advantage, I don't really care about the difference. In any of those cases, you've got a clearly winning position for one side. And just playing for raw equity in terms of those numbers is not necessarily really what's important in those positions. Once you get something closer to a winning position, what's actually much more important is making sure that you do something that gives you the best chance to convert your advantages while allowing the minimum counterplay, minimum counter chances, minimum chances to mess up that advantage. And I think a lot of good players are actually very willing to make a move that would take what was a +8 advantage down to a +5 or a +4 or even lower than that if they see a very clear path to winning the game. So I don't believe that you can just look at the equity change in terms of the jump in these numbers to really decide what is an important error or is not. And in fact, some of the changes that are relatively small in those numbers, in those evaluation numbers, are important when you are closer to that equal range and you are talking about more serious changes in the evaluation of the position. F5 is one of these moves. By equity, by evaluation number, it's not something that's necessarily a huge change, but it is actually very crucial, and it is where I believe that with best play from white, we could have gone from a position where things were just slightly better for white to actually clearly better for white if white had properly punished me. And there is more than one way to do it, but probably the best way that the computer comes up with for punishing this move F5 is an immediate knight C1 here. And you see that the equity bar stays at about the same level. And the reason this move is so good and really does lead to a clear advantage for white, for one thing, there's an immediate tactical threat of bishop takes F5 that black has to deal with. But it's not just about that. It's about that we're clearing the line for the rook to pressure the bishop and king in the pin at the same time as we're making a path for the knight to activate itself by B3 and C5. And one thing I underestimated in this position is that white's attack actually comes pretty fast at a time when black is a little bit underdeveloped, underprepared for it. And if he castles queenside to get out of this, in some sense, he's walking right into that attack if white correctly finds this knight C1 to B3 to C5 maneuver, which my opponent did not do. But you'll notice instead that after this move F5, so let's look at the equity bar again. Before F5, it was hanging around a slight advantage for white, and then it suddenly moved up to a big advantage. And then white instead decided to play bishop B5, and it sunk back a little bit. Not back to where it was before F5. White still has a little bit more advantage than before, but not nearly as much as was possible if white had found the best move, knight C1. And that is why I mark this move as a dubious move. It is not the best move. It doesn't spoil all of white's advantage, but it is not the best way of punishing black in this position. And in fact, what I should have done going back here after bishop g3, the safest and smartest move would have been, instead of playing f5, to play knight ge7, finishing up my development, blocking tricks on the e-file, still reserving the choice of castling to either side, but avoiding some of the perils that could happen on the e-file, as we're going to see in the next few moves here. So instead, I did make this inferior move of f5, but my opponent didn't find the best way to take advantage of bishop b5. And in fact, the computer is fine with my choice on the next two moves, a6, bishop a4, b5. There's no radical change in evaluation here. Now, b5 does change the nature of the position a lot. It makes it a lot less likely I'm going to castle on the queen side, and it makes it structurally very different than positions without b5. But in terms of actual evaluation of the position, it's neither much better nor much worse than black's other alternatives. And this is actually an important thing to understand here, is that when we talk about moves being better or worse, what we're really talking about is what is the change in that evaluation from one position to the next. And again, I think this is actually a good moment to stop and talk about more generally what's happening when we're actually doing a computer analysis. If you've played on some of these chess servers, you know that you often have an option after you've played a game to press a button to request a computer analysis, where it will give you not only scores for each position, but also its best guess of what it thinks is a good move and a bad move. It might even add some annotations like question marks and exclamation points there. And you do have to take some of that with a grain of salt. But in order to understand why, I want to talk about what the computer is actually doing when you request an analysis like this. So what's actually happening when you get a computer analysis is that the system is taking the game that you just played on the server and farming out each and every position after each move to a bunch of different computers at once. So they are independently analyzing each of those positions and coming up with a score for where it thinks that evaluation bar should be on that particular move. And you notice, for instance, that what it's likely to say before b5 is where this bar is now, and where this move, whose bar is after b5 is about the same. So we're not having a massive change in evaluation on that one place, but we are collecting all of those evaluations, all those scores throughout the whole game, and then collating them to one place. And after those evaluations are done, then we're looking at where is there a big change in score and saying, if the evaluation went way down after a particular move for your side, you probably made a mistake. You did something to bring that down. All right. But one of the reasons you really need to be careful is the second point on this list here, which is that when you send out for the computer analysis on each of these moves, the way this is happening on the servers is that each individual position is being analyzed by some computer in the cloud very quickly. And in order to get them all back to the central place in a relatively short amount of time. And because they're going very quickly, they're not always super accurate. There is a chance that, especially in more complex, murky positions, that the computer is misevaluating the evaluation at a particular point. And for that reason, it might actually be mistakenly identifying particular moves as being a big mistake or a good move based on a false idea of where the evaluation really changed. So that is something you need to be a little careful about. And one way you can be careful about that is by, after you've gotten this computer analysis, going back over the game in more detail and setting your program to higher thresholds for memory and for depth of moves, and to make sure that you are really getting a more accurate view of the evaluation at those particular points. But I also want to point out this whole idea of what I'm calling a murky position here. I'm going to go into a little more detail about what I mean by that later. But one of the things that you can find out that's important is not just, what's most important is not just the objective evaluation of the position at any given time, but also this very fact that the computer was having trouble analyzing it correctly and coming to a score. Maybe it's taking a longer period of time for it to converge to a sensible score, actually tells you something about the nature of the position. And it might be giving you helpful indicators as to whether this is a move where you really did the right thing or not, that are separate from the objective evaluation of the score. Again, that sounds a little mysterious, but I will explain it a little more as we get into more detail in the game. So let's see here. After b5, the opponent played bishop back to b3. And I made really what was my second error of the game, knight f6, causing another evaluation change in white's favor on that evaluation bar. And the reason this is a mistake is really more of a tactical reason than a positional reason here. It turns out that white has an immediate way to take advantage of the pressure on the e-file here. But it is also the case that white has to find the single right move in order to really punish knight f6. And the single right move for white is this same trick we saw before, knight c1. But it's for a slightly different reason this time. This time we see the knight wants to go on this route of d3 to c5. But the trick is that it's not just that the knight is coming in, it's that black's queen is actually overworked protecting the bishop at e7 and the pawn at c7, or bishop at e6 and the pawn at c7 at the same time. And this is going to lead to white either winning the pawn or getting a very nasty setup with his pieces for him. So if black plays the natural move castles here, one thing is that white can actually chop the pawn off at c7 right away, although the computer thinks it's more accurate to play knight d3 first, and after queen f7, then to chop the pawn at c7. And this really ends up being black's best defense here, but white does end up getting a clear pawn extra here. Now that pawn, you can say, is limited in terms of white's pawns on the queen side aren't great, even though it's 4 versus 3. It's going to be hard to take advantage of that pawn majority. But that combined with the weak dark squares in black's position, the bishop over here eyeing these squares and the knight also eyeing the e5 and c5 squares, and the fact that it really is not a good idea for black to trade off his light squared bishop for white's dark squared bishop, because then his pawns will be too weak and white's pressure will be too much. All of this means that this position really is clearly better for the white side. However, it turns out that black doesn't have to lose the pawn, but trying not to lose the pawn would actually lead to an even worse outcome for black. Instead, after knight c1, if black were to play king f7 in this position to defend his bishop, then knight d3, immediately threatening the fork on the queen and bishop, and if black defends with a move like rook a e8, for instance, knight c5, queen d8, bishop e5, the computer considers to be actually even better for white than the previous variation where white won the c-pawn, because here the pieces are really well entrenched on those dark squares, and black cannot take without white replacing it with a rook that gets down there too. In some positions the pawn might even take, probably more likely the rook, but if the pressure on d5 were great enough, that can be a considerable thing. But in general, this is going to be a very, very uncomfortable position for black, where he is passive, white has a strong dark squared grip, and black's chances of getting an attack on the king side are not much now. He can't really advance those pawns because white's pieces are just too active. So that is why knight f6 is really a mistake. However, if we go back and look at this, after b5, bishop b3, instead of the move knight f6, the best move for black here that would have actually kept white to only a minimal advantage was for black to play an immediate king f7 before developing the knight. And the reason this turns out to actually be better is because now if knight c1, black has a good option of f4, pushing white's bishop back before white has a chance to get the knight d3 and knight to c5 attack in. And in fact, if knight d3, black just calmly now brings his queen up to d6, and you can see here that he has a slight advantage here because both of white's bishops are going to be pretty bad now. Well, actually, he doesn't have a slight advantage. White has a slight advantage, but it's not nearly as bad for black as before because both of white's bishops are going to be bad, and black does have more prospects for a kingside attack here. With white's less active bishop, his king won't be in as much danger. It is true that white does get the active rook on the e-file and knight at d3, but that is not enough by itself to really put too much pressure on black's position and make this too bad for black here. So black is doing much better in this variation than in comparable variations where white's bishop sinks into e5 or white wins that c7 pawn. So it was a mistake on my part missing this possibility after knight f6 of this quick knight c1 attack. However, my opponent returns the favor when he played a4. And a4, again, is a move that I would say is not a disaster. White still keeps a slight advantage, but white has basically just missed the opportunity that I gave him on the previous move by knight f6. And in fact, after castles, at this point, I feel like we're basically through the opening stage of the game, and I've managed to escape to a middle game with nothing more than a sort of ordinary opening slight advantage for white, where I do have good prospects of a kingside attack, and my position is relatively secure without any more pressure on the e-file there. But it was really right after getting to this position that things started to deteriorate for white. And white ended up making this plan of advancing the pawns on the king side, which actually seriously weakened his position and started giving black the advantage soon enough here. And white's next move of h4, which I've marked dubious here, you'll notice that that evaluation bar suddenly jumps down to about an equal position here, maybe a slight advantage for white, but so slight that it's almost equal here. But I think things are actually worse than that for white in this position. And the reason I say that is not that white has drifted into a worse position yet, but that a human player isn't going to make a move like h4 without having certain ideas in mind that are actually probably going to worsen that position even more, as happened in the game. In fact, as we're going to see, the right ways for white to follow up h4 in order to avoid drifting into a worse position are going to be probably not the kind of thing that white would have wanted to do if they played h4 in the first place. You have to kind of properly recognize that this was a mistaken plan and change tack in order to avoid making things worse after this. And what I mean by that is that after the move f4, which is black's best move here, white's best way forward, what he did was not a disaster yet, but his best way forward actually was to sacrifice his knight for 2 pawns with knight f4, gf4, bishop f4. And this is a very interesting positional sacrifice here, because one thing that's maybe surprising about this is that white is not actually going for a brutal kingside attack trying to mate black when he makes this knight sacrifice for 2 pawns. Even though black's king may look a little exposed with the missing pawn cover here, it is the case that black has enough pieces over there and white doesn't really have enough pieces to make serious threats to black's king. Black is not really in any danger of a mating attack or anything like that here. However, what ends up happening is white is going to get a lot of pawns off the board. And you see here I've marked on the queen side, this pawn trade is going to happen eventually and the rooks are going to get traded too. And the fact is that what actually happens in these positions is the endgames that result end up having black having a very small number of pawns that are pretty rickety and white having the 2 bishops. And it is the case that those endgames white actually has pretty good drawing chances in, that it's hard for black to really create enough pressure on white's position. The 2 pawns provide adequate compensation for the knight, given some of the other positional factors here. And in fact, I'm not going to go into detail on them, but if you look at some of the computer lines that follow this, very often white voluntarily goes for a trade of queens. It's actually not bad for white to trade queens in these positions because the endgames are pretty holdable for white. So again, you're not playing a move like h4 thinking I'm going to sacrifice a knight for 2 pawns as a defensive sacrifice and just try to like tough out the endgame. But that would have actually been white's best way of playing here. It wasn't too late though when white played f4, bishop h2 in response to f4 for white to maintain equality. But as we're going to see over the next several moves, it turns out that it really becomes necessary for white to make this knight sacrifice on f4 at some point over the next few moves. And there were several good times when white could do it. But if white doesn't do it, white is going to drift into a worse position where black's attack becomes pretty intense. And at this point, the computer thinks things are just about dead equal. It's actually giving a 0.0 or somewhere really close to it evaluation. And that's going to continue to be the case for the next several moves. And there's no sense in which the next few moves I've made are much better than some of the alternatives. They are good moves among several good moves. But I do think it's worth looking at the strategy of why I picked some of those particular moves. So King G7 is a good move because white does have a little bit of latent pressure with this bishop here. That can be a problem once black's bishop moves away and can make an annoying pin on that pawn. And sidestepping that and defending the pawns a little better on the king side is a good place for black's king. But it also has the advantage of opening up the h-file so that black's rook can switch to the h-file. So King G7 is among black's best moves in this position, although he also has other good moves such as just rook AE8 would be fine. It would also not lead to any kind of radical change in evaluation. It would still be roughly equal. But King G7 is a good, solid, strategic way of playing. And the same goes through for the next move. After Queen D2, again, Rook AE8 would be a good move. But the move I played is also a very good move, Knight E7. And part of the reason that this is such a good move is that the knight at C6 wasn't really doing anything. It was kind of hemmed in by white's pawns. But at E7, it has a really nice route to the king side, going to F5, where it keeps an eye on these dark squares around the king. And it also has an alternative route of going to G6, which hits H4, but also hits F4. So whichever way it happens to go, it's getting at this spider web of weak dark squares around white's king. And I think this is generally a good strategy. If you don't have an immediate tactical breakthrough, often just taking your least active piece and bringing it to a more active place is going to be a good way to start improving that position and to start building up a good plan here. But at this point, white still actually was fine, but this was kind of the last moment where white could really save himself, or one of the last few moments where he could save himself by making this knight F4 sacrifice. And there's a few different lines I'm going to show you now in this position. Let me just clear these arrows out of the way first. That are all pretty good for white, but sort of in rough order of preference, you can play h takes g5, knight f4, gf4, queen f4. And again, the computer considers this position kind of dead equal in terms of white has enough compensation with the two bishops, with a slightly safer king, and he's going to be okay in this position. And again, queen trades may actually be good for white in these positions because they kind of lessen the attacking chances black has on white's king. But the point is, without the pawn wedge and white getting rid of his knight at e2 that was pretty passive anyway, white's doing all right in this position. And black's only going to have pawns on the queen side, which can't really do much. So it's going to be very hard to win endgames for black here. There's another variation on this that's pretty similar. Going back to the position after knight e7, white could have played a takes b5, rook a8, and then traded. And this is pretty much the same as before. It's likely those trades were going to happen anyway, but this is also evaluated by the computer as roughly equal. There is a third variation involving the knight sacrifice, which actually the computer thinks is not quite as good for white, but still good for no more than a slight advantage for black. And that is immediately, not g3, which is the move in the game, is immediately playing knight takes f4 before trading pawns and keeping the h-pawns on the board. I think it's actually very interesting that the computer thinks this is slightly less accurate because after gf4, bishop f4, attacking the pawn at h5, black now has the natural defense knight f5. White actually has a tactic to win a third pawn here, and that is a takes b5, trade, and then a sacrifice of bishop h6 check. So that after knight h6, queen g5 check, black's king has to abandon one of the two knights, and the best way for him to do that is king f7, queen h6. So interestingly, white now actually has 3 pawns for the piece rather than 2, so white's not really even in a material deficit. And white has good compensation here. But interestingly, after queen d6, the computer actually thinks this is now slightly better for black. Not a huge advantage, but it's actually more of an advantage for black here than in the other variations where white had only 2 pawns for the piece. And the reason for that really comes down to white lacking a dark squared bishop now. It's the fact that white no longer has that bishop pair advantage, and he no longer has the bishop to defend his dark squares, and the dark squares are a little drafty around the king. Not only that, but this rook might end up switching back to g8 and putting some pressure here. And again, it's not a disaster for white. If white is careful and defends well, white should be no worse than, slightly worse, slightly better for black here. But it is the case that black is the one with the better chances, whereas the other lines were really closer to a dynamic equality here, because that dark squared bishop was so important, even though in this position white has 3 pawns for the piece, and the other 2 positions we looked at, white only had 2 pawns for the piece. So I found that pretty interesting here. But let's go back and look at the game continuation here. After knight e7, I told you h4 was a mistake, a step in the wrong direction, but if white had correctly figured out how to sacrifice that knight at f4 in one of these occasions, White would not have drifted into a worse position. White would have just spoiled his advantage. But it is after White's next move of g3 that Black now actually for the first time in the game becomes better. And that's actually going to continue to be the case for pretty much the whole game going forward. This is going to be a better position for Black. This is really a case where White's plan of g3 was overly optimistic, trying to break down Black's pawn barrier. And I get why he did it, because he saw that if he didn't break up those pawns, that attack on the king side was going to be much more devastating in the long run. However, the problem is just that Black's pieces are much more active than White's. But interestingly, even though g3 is a mistake and Black should be much better here, my very next move, which seems so natural, is actually a significant inaccuracy that should turn over or really give up a lot of that advantage for Black after knight f5, and we see suddenly it jumps back down to equality. And the reason for that is the same reason that we've already been seeing, is that White's knight f4 is actually an extremely effective defense here. And in fact, I should correct myself here. The best way for White to do that in this position is to trade on g5 first and then make the knight f4 sacrifice. And at this point, it's a little bit worse for White than if he had not played g3, but it is still no more than a slight advantage for Black. White is actually holding fairly well here. He kind of regrets having made the g3 move, but his king side is still solid enough, and he has good drawing chances here. It is also possible to do this slightly differently by trading at b5 and trading the rooks first and then playing knight f4, but again, it's pretty much the same thing. No more than a slight advantage for Black here. But going back, instead of knight f5, the move that I should have played in order not to give White this defensive resource, there are actually two of them here. One of those moves that is best for maintaining the advantage is actually knight g6. All right? So just as we talked about before, that knight has an alternate route here, and this one still puts pressure on h4, but also curtails the knight f4 sacrifices by putting a little extra protection on that, and is going to end up in a clear advantage for Black. There is actually a second move instead of knight g6 that also works effectively here, and that is to actually play bishop g4 right away and jump in that way. And both of these moves are a little bit different from each other tactically, but they both lead to positions where Black has some good attacking chances, and defense for White becomes pretty tough here. But I missed the opportunity by playing a slightly inaccurate knight f5, but it ended up being no real difference because White was really fixated on not sacrificing the knight, but instead capturing with pawns, as he did with h takes g5, and then g takes f4. And it's at this point that it goes back to a clear advantage for Black and stays that way for the rest of the game, or worse for White here. In terms of Black really is winning with the best play here, and there is more than one way to do it, but the lines are becoming very tactical and sharp here. And one thing that's going to be really interesting is that the move I played on the next move, knight h4, is one that is so natural, jumping in and threatening the fork here, and still maintains a good advantage for Black. If you look here at that bar, there was not really a big change in evaluation. So you'll notice that I've given this a dubious symbol, which seems a little strange. Why would I say that my own move was dubious when the computer evaluation is really still about the same, and this is apparently a good attacking move? And it's interesting, the reason I say this is because when I first started analyzing this and did request a computer analysis, the computer did say that the knight h4 move was worse and was a mistake. When it was looking at it over a very short time, it turns out that if you look at this over a longer time horizon, analyzing a little more deeply, that it does turn out to be a good move. It is just as sound as Black's other attacking combination. But the difference is that it's actually a lot harder to win with knight h4. It requires a lot more precision compared to Black had a very good positional way forward instead of knight h4, and that was playing the move g4. Whoops, sorry, I meant to say g4 here. Um, G4 is actually a very safe way of playing that also leads to very good clear advantages for black with a strong attack, not having to make a lot of sacrifices. As white's pawn at f4 is going to be blocking his pieces in, trades are going to be happening, the knight's going to be hopping into g4, the rook coming in as well, and black's other pieces are going to be able to swoop in there once that knight at f5 moves in, probably to h4 eventually. But what black's going to be able to do this in a much more of a low-risk way, continuing this attack. So even though equity-wise, evaluation-wise, Nxh4 and G4 are pretty similar, I consider G4 actually just the plain smarter way of playing because it's an easy way for black to get a good advantage, a good attack, without having to go into razor-sharp variations that entail a lot of risk, entail a lot of one false move, one miscalculation could lead to a worse position. And that gets to what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about these murky positions. So now I'm going to define a new term here and talk about something that I like to call tightrope positions. So tightrope positions are positions that require a whole lot of precision. They're ones that the second best move can be a lot worse than that first best move and cause a big evaluation drop. You don't find your best move, suddenly you've lost your advantage, or even worse, turned a win into a loss. They're also the kind of positions that are often misevaluated by the computer with limited time because you have this issue that the computer not going enough moves deep, either because it's just set to stop at a certain number of moves or it has to stop because time ran out, might get a misevaluation because it misses some of the tactical nuances further down the line. And when you already have an advantage, these are not the kinds of positions you want. So I think this becomes a very important thing, is that even if the computer misanalyzed a variation and said that the position was worse and then later changed its mind and decided it was better, the fact that the computer was vacillating so much may be giving you that hint that you are actually taking this game into these kinds of tightrope positions where you're forcing yourself to be really precise in order to maintain that advantage. And on that note, I'm going to show also here a little text how we talk about how we know that we're in a tightrope position. So one way that we've already talked about is when the engine has different calculations for the line. So you'll often see when you turn on the engine, you see a little bit of vacillation as it's calculating its lines and deciding what the particular score of that position should be. But the more a position is a tightrope position, the more time that takes for the computer to actually converge on a quote-unquote correct value. So if you see that the variations are continuing to vary wildly in their evaluation for longer periods of time than compared to other lines, that can give you a good clue that you're in a tightrope position. But also, another important thing that's very helpful to do, you can often on these computer servers set it that you have not just your first best move shown, but your first two or first three best moves shown. And that also gives you a big hint of when you're looking at a tightrope position, is that if you see a sudden huge change in the evaluation of the position, if one were to play the second best move, that is a big clue that you're in what we call a tightrope position, where you have to find that perfectly accurate move just to maintain that advantage. And what we're going to see is that even though objectively Nxh4 and G4 are equivalent moves, if white had found a better defense, white could have gotten me into a really classic example of a tightrope position here, where for about 10 moves in a row, play is basically completely forced on both sides. And when I say completely forced, I don't mean in the sense of there's just a capture, an immediate single obvious recapture, or a check and only one way to get a check. I mean that in what looks like a murky position where you might try several different moves, there's actually only one move that maintains the evaluation of that position. For both sides is what's actually going to happen here. So black makes one false move, he can lose the advantage. White makes one false move, he can suddenly get mated or just lose a massive amount of material. So I'm going to show you this classic example of this tightrope variation here. After knight h4, the move that white should have played, by far the best defense, is to play rook over to f1. And that's why I give it this box here, which is informant notation for only move. And there are going to be a whole bunch of only moves coming up here. In fact, There's only one good way for black to pursue the attack after rook f1, and it's bishop h3, after which white's only way of surviving for this attack is f takes g5. And the next move is not quite an example of a tightrope because black actually does have two good moves. But in order to maintain a strong attack, black has to either play knight g4, which is the best move, or the second best move is knight e4, which is still not quite evaluated as high as knight g4. And you'll see actually the computer is going to be changing its evaluation as it goes here because this is a hard line to calculate. It is better for black than it first thinks it is. However, it is the case that it's never going to get quite to as strong for black as the knight g4 variation. But the point is that after fg5, black is forced to find one of these lines in order to maintain this attack. Has to have this sacrificial continuation, knight g4, going forward. And in fact, the best defense for white at this point becomes knight f4. But then we have a long train of really tightrope variation here, which is bishop f1, only move for black to maintain the attack. Rook f1 is the only good defense. Knight h2, again, the only way for black to really keep this going. White needs to take back with a queen. Taking with a king runs into more trouble with a rook coming to the h file. But in fact, now black has to play rook h8 or he is losing. Now, that's not that big a deal because rook h8 is actually a pretty obvious move in this position, right? White's attacking black's knight at h4. There's no other way to defend it. It would be silly to retreat it with knight f5 at this point. This is not a hard move to find, but it is in fact the only way for black to maintain the advantage here and not even drift into a worse position. And after this, a takes b5 is best for white. Knight f3 check. Black can win the queen for a rook and a minor piece. But interestingly, black's best way of pursuing queen g4 now forces white into an only move of bishop takes d5. And again, black's only move, rook h8 check, and knight h3 is the defense for white. Believe it or not, it may seem like things have suddenly calmed down here, but we are now in a position where black still has only one move to maintain the advantage. And you can imagine that this is a hard line to calculate. I feel like not many players, unless they are, Magnus Carlsen Grandmaster level, would have calculated this from the point of rook f1 a full 9 moves ago. But there are some players possibly who could have calculated this far, but they would have to see at this point that rook takes h3 is actually the only way for black to maintain the advantage. And the reason for that is that if black were to make another move, such as a takes b5, recapturing this pawn, white has an immediate rook f7 check with a draw by repetition. And black has nothing better than shuffling his king. Same thing if black plays a5 instead of a takes b5. But fortunately for black, this exchange sacrifice rook h3, which is necessary to break up the perpetual check, actually is enough for black to win the game. After rook takes h3, queen f4 check is best. And at this point, we're no longer in a tightrope position. There's actually a few different equivalent ways that the game could go. But this is going to be a winning endgame for black. And to give you an example of why that would be, after king g2, queen d2 check, and a few other checks here, black grabs the c-pawn with check, and eventually plays a5, securing himself a passed a-pawn here. And in this case, this really is a clearly better position for black that he should be able to convert to a win because white is just not going to be able to create any real substantial threats here. And black will gradually get that a-pawn down the board, but it will take some time. So this is something that should be convertible to a win in the long run. But the point is that this is actually best play, essentially, all the way from the point where black played knight h4. So you had to make a sequence of about 10 perfect moves in a row to convert knight h4 to this kind of winning position. Whereas, assuming, of course, that white found a whole bunch of perfect moves in a row as well. Whereas after g4, I spent some time looking at some of these variations, and one thing I found out was that for the most part, black gets positions where he is not in a tightrope position, where he often has 2 or 3 different moves that maintain the advantage. And this positional way of attacking ends up being, I think, a much safer way for black to pursue his advantage without putting himself in a do-or-die situation of having to be absolutely perfect in order to maintain that advantage. And that is why I mark Knight-h4 as a dubious move, even though it is not really objectively any worse than g4 by the evaluation. But, one of the challenges of playing sharp chess like this after Knight-h4 is it's hard for white to find the best moves too, and white certainly did not. King f2 should be an immediate losing move, and we see a huge jump to about a negative 5.9 evaluation. This is a clearly winning position for black here. But interestingly, the next move I made is a move that the computer evaluates really harshly. Bishop g4 suddenly jumps from about a negative 5.4 to a negative 3.6. But you'll notice I did not give it an annotation of a question mark here. I don't think it's actually a mistake. And this gets what I was talking about earlier when it comes to the realm of evaluations, in that black still has an evaluation comfortably above 2.0 in his favor. Black is still most definitely winning after bishop g4, even if it's not the computer-preferred equity move. But furthermore, when I ask myself, is this as good a way of playing as what the computer preferred? What I'm really asking myself is not just what wins or what wins fastest, but what wins with the least amount of counterplay. And I can argue, I think it's a good argument actually, that the computer-preferred move is a little bit better than this one in that it finishes the game faster and really allows no counterplay. But it is also the case that if I followed up bishop g4 correctly, I should have been able to win this game with no serious counterplay by white. Notice I say if, though. We're going to see that I didn't follow this up perfectly later on. All right? So to show you what the computer actually preferred instead of bishop g4, the move that it considers best is knight takes f3. And arguably this is the best way of playing because of a very pretty line here. First off, the knight is making a big fork on the queen, the rook, and the bishop. White has no choice but to take it right away. But now black immediately jumps in with bishop g4 check. And because of potential knight forks at e4, white really doesn't have any better place to run the king than g2. But now black can immediately follow up with bishop f3 check. And this is going to result in a very fast loss for white. And the reason really becomes black gets a killer attack on the light squares, getting a mate or forcing white to give up the queen very, very quickly. To give one example of what could happen, if the king goes back to g1, then knight e4 attacks the queen, queen e3, queen h3, and white has no choice but to give up the queen because mate at g2 is coming, and white can either sacrifice the queen for the bishop at f2 or for the knight at queen f2, but either way it's still going to be a quick mate without white having a queen anymore. Instead, after bishop f3 check, if white had taken the bishop, it's pretty similar. Queen g4 check. Now king f2 runs smack into a knight fork, and king e3 is no better because black just gets a check on the e-file, and you have a choice. Do you run back into the knight fork, or do you run into a little mate here at d3? So whichever way you look at it, this is going to be curtains for white after knight f3 in just a few moves. So the point being, though, that even though bishop g4 is not as fast, it is still a sure win for black if he follows it up properly here. So after bishop g4, white followed up with the move knight g1, and bishop f3 happened, and then knight takes f3, and now queen h3. This is really interesting. So this move, queen h3, I'm giving a full question mark to, not just a dubious one, even though it should still lead to a winning position for black. All right, and the reason is, notice that the equity drop, even though there was an evaluation drop in this, it wasn't nearly as big as the bishop g4 one. But the reason I say that this is actually a serious mistake is not that it spoils the advantage or turns it to a position where I'm not winning anymore, but because it takes us back to a tightrope position. It puts us in a situation where white actually has an incredible piece of counterplay, which doesn't quite work to change the evaluation and stop white from losing. But it puts black in a position where black has to defend absolutely perfectly against white's counterplay in order to maintain that advantage. Whereas Black actually had a way of winning that didn't give white any counterplay in this position. And that move to maintain the advantage with no counterplay was knight g4 check. So the reason this is so good again is has to do with his knight at f3. It's that white's king needs to stay in contact with that knight. If white's king abandons it, black's not only going to win the knight back at f3, he's winning back all the material he sacrificed, and he's forking white's queen and rook. He's going to have a material advantage and a killer attack on the king's side. Just an easily winning position. But the problem is that white doesn't really have a good way to hold on to that knight. So if white plays king g3, he's actually just walking smack into an immediate win with g takes f4 check. When if the king has to come out of h4, it's going to be quickly mated, or if otherwise white has to give the queen with queen f4, and that's also going to be curtains very quickly. After knight g4 check, there is a better defense for white at king e2, but it doesn't really work any better. And you have to be careful about why that is here, because give white a little more time, let his king run away to c1, he actually will be doing okay here. But black has a forcing sequence here, which stops white's king from getting away. He doesn't have to make two only moves in a row, but they're not particularly hard ones to find. They are rook e8 check. And again, white can't safely run the king away because he has to defend the knight with at f3, but he can play knight e5 blocking. But now black just chops that knight off at e5. And the reason this is so good is that after d takes e5, queen g4 check, again another only move, not only checks white's king but stops it from running away to d1, and at this point it becomes very easy. Once white's king is forced to stay out in the open, black just has a devastating attack and will win this position very quickly and easily. There is another try for white after knight e5 to run the king away right to d1 instead of recapturing the knight, but that doesn't work any better because of knight ef3. And again, black is actually winning material here. If rook takes rook, he can just capture the queen instead of recapturing. And he is just absolutely clobbering white material-wise and with an exposed king. So the point is that knight g4 check was a simple way to win. And if I had found this, there was no problem with the bishop g4 combination. But this move queen h3, which doesn't spoil the win, does actually make my life much more complicated. And the reason it makes my life much more complicated is that white has this amazing bit of counterplay with rook e7 check, which you may notice the evaluation bar is doing some wild things here. It's actually not going to change the evaluation of the position in general. Black's still going to be winning, but the lines are so complicated that it takes the computer a little bit of time to catch up and really figure out what the heck is going on here. So it turns out after rook e7 check, black has only one move to maintain the advantage. If he is sloppy and moves his king back to g8, white actually gets complete equality after. There's a couple ways to do it, but one way is the immediate queen e2, which defends knight f3, which was threatened to be taken with check, and also threatens queen e6 check with counterplay on black's king. And it turns out that this defense and counterplay at the same time provides just enough for white to be able to neutralize all of black's threats. I'm not going to go into the detail of the variation, but basically no matter what black plays, and there are a few options, they all just lead to complete equality now. White does have a second way to hold equality after king g8, which is to trade the knight first, and after queen h2 check, knight g2, rook e8 to then play queen e2. Same idea as before to get the queen down to e6. But he does have to find that queen e2 move. That is a crucial part of the defense here. And in all these variations, a big part of the reason why white is able to hang on is that black's king was misplaced at g8, allowing this queen e6 check possibility. So it turns out after rook e7 check, the only way black actually hangs on to the win here is to play king back to h8 instead of g8. However, things are still not simple. It turns out that white has an amazing continuation here that makes things very difficult for black, which is bishop takes d5. Crazy sacrifice here. So notice again that since white's not working with check here, he needed to make a move that defended knight f3 so that black can't take it with check. But he managed to do this in a way that sacrifices and opens up black's position at the same time, while also handily attacking black's rook at a8. And in fact, if black is not careful now, black can not only lose the advantage, he can lose the game. It turns out the very natural knight takes d5 is a completely losing move. You go from black winning to white winning all of a sudden. And the reason why is a just astounding tactic here. I'll give you a second to think about it. See if you can figure out white's tactic here. It's rook h7 check. Look at that. Black can't take the rook because of knight takes g5 check, forking the king and queen. However, it's more than that. The rook gets over the h-file, and after black's king sidesteps the check, can now chop off this key attacker at h4. And it's not just that black's attack completely dies after rook takes h4. It's that the opening of the g-file actually allows white's other rook to get into the game, rook g8 check. Now again, black can't walk into a knight fork of the queen, so he has to go to h8. But then, bam, f5 opens up the diagonal for white's queen to come in, and suddenly white has a completely winning position where his king is totally safe and black's king is toast. I found this pretty amazing. I found, okay, black has to make a mistake to do this, has to play that knight takes d5 move, but that's an easy mistake to make, especially in a 3-minute game, right? I had no idea way back after I made my sacrificial attack and thought I was hopping my queen into h3 with a dangerous attack here, that I was giving white a chance for this crazy sacrificial attack of his own instead of capturing to play rook e7 check and then bishop takes d5. And if I'd known that was coming, I would say, no way, I would have played queen h3 and allowed that. However, it turns out after bishop takes d5, there actually is a defense for black to avoid that attack and maintain a winning position. It is rook ae8, saving his rook and countering white's rook just in time. Now white's best move here is queen e2, as we saw before, but without the king at g8, it doesn't end up being quite as effective for white. Knight takes d5 happens, queen e5 check, knight back to f6, knight h4, queen h2, knight g2. And now black has only one way forward, but it is enough to win. And that is rook takes e7, queen takes e7, knight g4 check. And black is going to win the knight at g2 with a winning endgame here. The only move for white to really survive is king e1, which is crucial because white's king will actually succeed in running away to the queen side, but only at the cost of losing this knight and dropping into an endgame where black has a winning material advantage. However, at the same time, even though this is a winning position for black in the long run, it is a case where there is still a lot of work to do. It's still not that easy because his king is exposed, and right now white's rook can't really get over to the king side and harass black's king much, but he's have to be on guard for that. That his king is exposed, perpetual checks are a potential threat in the long run, and that it will take some technique to convert this, but it is indeed a winning position for black. At the same time, I can also say, if I knew I had to dodge all of that from white and get to this long run winning endgame a piece up, would I have played queen h3 instead of knight g4 check? No way. So I consider queen h3 to definitely be a mistake in terms of allowing all that counterplay, even though it did not spoil the win. Even though, going back to remember here, queen h3 was less of an equity drop than bishop g4 compared to the immediate sacrifice on f3. But queen h3 is the bigger mistake because it is the one not that loses more in evaluation points, but the one that offers white more concrete counterplay chances. However, white missed his chance for counterplay here and played knight h4. And at this point, things are basically over. There is no more serious counterplay in the position. So queen h2 check happened, knight g2, knight e4 check, as we saw before, and then white resigned after king e1. So all in all, a pretty game with some pretty interesting kingside tactical attacking possibilities. But I hope that it's also a good lesson that you have to consider not just raw evaluation of positions, but that evaluations, once you're beyond the -2, -3, or +2, +3, don't necessarily mean as much. And what's much more important is sequestering counterplay when you're in a more advantageous position. And then even in a position where you think you've played great and you've been the one with a brilliant attack, there might be brilliant tactical possibilities for your opponent too. And you need to sometimes dig into those variations to see them. So I hope this has been a good lesson for you. I know it has been for me. Have a great day.